Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is video number 8, if my count is correct, in our review, response, and refutation of Brock Hollett's book, Debunking Preterism. And in our last video, a couple of weeks ago, I took note that we were going to examine what he has to say about the Olivet Discourse. Now, keep in mind that beginning next Monday, I'm going to begin producing an extensive study of the Olivet Discourse. Pardon me. This will be my own attempt to share with you my convictions about what the Olivet Discourse actually teaches. Let's make no mistake. The Olivet Discourse is really and truly, in many, many ways, the foundation of all New Testament eschatology. If we misconstrue, if we distort, if we misunderstand the Olivet Discourse, then everything that follows in our understanding of eschatology will be tainted. Paul's epistles to the Thessalonians, based upon the Olivet Discourse. John's revelation, based upon the Olivet Discourse. And on it goes. We find echoes, we find reflections of the Olivet Discourse throughout the entirety of the New Testament corpus. So once again, if we misunderstand and misapply the Olivet Discourse, then our entire eschatology will be messed up. Nothing illustrates that more than Brock Hollett's book. Now, I want you to notice something. Brock Hollett says on page 28, he calls attention to how Kenneth Gentry says the disciples, when they asked, in response to Jesus' statement that the temple was going to be destroyed, the disciples said, "Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Gentry says, well, the disciples were confused. And Hollett says in response to that, Gentry imagines that the apostles, quote, wrongly associated, unquote, the destruction of the temple with the end of the world. He likewise associates that misunderstanding with Marcellus Kick in his book. And yet, then Hollett says, these preterists would have us to believe that the disciples incorrectly connected these two events, and that's the coming of the Lord Judge and the destruction of the temple, connected these two events despite having spent 3 years under the Lord's direct tutelage. But as we will see, this connection is derived from the prophetic timeline as established by the prophets. In other words, Brock Hollett is saying here, no, the disciples were correct to link the fall of Jerusalem with the coming of the Lord. It's the partial preterist and the preterist who claim that the disciples were mistaken. However, on page 30, 2 pages later, Brock Hollett says this, it will be argued in this book that the questions at Olivet arose because the disciples did not have the schema needed to conceive of the possibility that 2 temples would be destroyed before the Lord's return. Jesus answered their questions by prophesying the destruction of the 3rd temple as preparation for his second advent. However, the disciples could only identify this mystery, watch this, after their contemporary generation ended without witnessing the Lord's return. We should consider that the apostles were also ignorant at this point of an extended inter-advent period of 2,000 years. So on the one hand, preterists, semi-preterists such as Kenneth Gentry, Marcellus Kick, are wrong when they say that the disciples mistakenly or linked the fall of Jerusalem and the coming of the Lord. The disciples were not confused. 2 pages later, he says, the disciples were confused. The disciples were ignorant. They didn't understand that there would be 2 temples destroyed. Folks, where in the text does it even slightly indicate 2 temples? Jesus said, do you not see these things? Folks, that's the temple that was standing right then, right there, 2,000 years ago. The time is coming in which not one stone shall be left standing on top of another. The disciples said, tell us when shall these things be? What things? The dismantling of that temple. And what shall be the sign of your coming? Mr. Hollett, as most dispensationalists, although he disavows the dispensational label, inserts a 2,000-year gap. And did you notice that he said the disciples were ignorant of the fact that there was supposed to be a 2,000-year inter-advent gap between AD 70 and the future? Now, wait a minute. He just chided preterists like Gentry, like Kick, for saying, well, the disciples didn't understand. Because after all, as Hollett says, the disciples had just spent 3.5 years with Jesus under his tutelage. Well, if the disciples should have known that the fall of Jerusalem and the coming of the Lord were linked because they'd spent 3 years with Jesus after all, then why didn't they understand that there would be a 2,000-year gap between AD 70 and his coming? Same tutelage, same time spent. This is horrible. This is truly bad argumentation. And then, of course, Mr. Hollett says the disciples simply did not understand that there would be 2 temples destroyed before the coming of the Lord. Wait a minute. No, that's not right. In Mr. Hollett's paradigm, the temple in AD 70 was destroyed, but at some future point of time, there will be another temple rebuilt with the permission of the Antichrist, the man of sin. That will be destroyed, and then there's got to be another temple that is constructed. That's 3 temples. That's 3 temples. And by the way, it is important for us to know that Jesus, quote, admittedly, Jesus did not specifically lay out the details of the second temple's destruction to be followed by the third temple's destruction and desolation. That's right, Jesus did not talk about it. And Paul didn't talk about it. So he says, quote, the concept that the temple will be rebuilt again can only be understood in retrospect after it became clear that the events of AD 70 did not fulfill the entirety of the Olivet Discourse prophecy. Folks, you see what he's doing here? Mr. Hollett is saying, well, Jesus said the coming of the Lord, his coming would be, quote, immediately after the tribulation of those days. Oh, but wait, the coming of the Lord didn't happen immediately after AD 70. Therefore, there must be another temple. There must be another destruction sometime in the future. That is what you call a priori argumentation. Mr. Hollett infers that this third temple is only, quote, inferred, unquote. Don't you think if there must be another temple, no, in fact, 2 more temples, don't you think we ought to have some really good, powerful evidence of that? And yet he admits, well, admittedly, Jesus didn't lay that out. Mr. Hollett's argumentation on Matthew 24 and the disciples, well, they were confused. No, they weren't confused. Oh, but yes, they were confused. Well, maybe not confused. They were just ignorant. And he makes the claim not based on anything that the disciples said, not based upon anything that the text says, but he bases his claim of their ignorance upon his own theological bias, upon his own theological presuppositions that the Lord did not come in AD 70. I'm sorry, theological prejudice, theological bias, theological presupposition is not exegesis. There is not one thing in the text of Matthew 24, pardon me, you really have to catch the power of this. There's not one thing in the text to suggest that the disciples were ignorant. Nothing. Mr. Hollett has invented this because of his preconceived ideas. Now look, if you want to have an extensive exegesis of Matthew 24 and its relationship to Paul's discourse in 1 Thessalonians, you need to get a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the Wedding of the King of Kings. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Order the book. Be sure to mention that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. In this book, I show at least 20 direct parallels between Jesus' discourse in the Olivet Discourse and Paul's writings in Thessalonians, demonstrating Paul well understood the relationship between the coming of the Lord and the fulfillment in that generation. Paul clearly understood, and Paul had no concept of a 2,000-year gap in fulfillment. Mr. Hollett is guilty of the very worst sort of the abuse of exegesis, the abuse of hermeneutic, and the abuse of logic. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this morning's Morning Musings. Hope you have a fantastic weekend. Hope to see you on Monday. Don't forget, we will begin our exegesis of the Olivet Discourse on Monday. We'll see you there.